What went wrong with Venezuela's economy? How did a country once considered one of Latin America's richest fall into crisis? Was it bad decisions, bad timing, or a system that slowly collapsed from within? How did oil wealth turn into economic pain for millions of ordinary people? And most importantly, could this disaster have been avoided? In this video, we uncover the hidden choices, turning points, and consequences that reshaped Venezuela's economy, and reveal why the answers are more complex than most people think. Once upon a time, Venezuela looked like a success story. What went wrong with an economy that once attracted investors, migrants, and global attention? How did a country blessed with oil, fertile land, and strategic location begin its slow decline? In the mid-20th century, Venezuela was among the richest nations in Latin America. Oil transformed cities, funded public projects, and created a powerful middle class. For many, prosperity felt permanent. But beneath the surface, a dangerous pattern was forming. Why did the economy become so dependent on a single resource? Why weren't oil profits invested in diversified industries, education, and long-term growth? As oil revenues poured in, other sectors quietly weakened. Manufacturing shrank. Agriculture faded. The economy became vulnerable to forces it could not control. Then came the warning signs. Global oil prices fluctuated. Government spending expanded faster than productivity. Political decisions replaced economic planning. When money was easy, problems were ignored. When conditions changed, the system had nothing to fall back on. Could this downturn have been avoided? Or was the foundation already fragile long before the crisis became visible? By the time inflation began to rise and shortages appeared, the damage was already deep. What looked like sudden collapse was, in reality, the result of years of silent decay. And this raises a critical question. Was Venezuela's economic crisis caused by a single moment of failure, or by decades of choices no one wanted to question? Every economic crisis has turning points. But what were the moments that quietly changed Venezuela's future, while the world looked away? As oil prices surged, governments expanded spending at an unprecedented pace. Social programs grew, subsidies multiplied, and the state took greater control over key industries. At first, this felt like progress. Poverty numbers fell. Consumption increased. But was the economy actually growing, or just spending borrowed time? Why did the government tighten its grip on private businesses? Why were price controls introduced despite warnings from economists? And what happens when companies are forced to sell at prices below cost? Production slowed. Imports replaced local manufacturing. Businesses closed or left the country. Oil money filled the gaps, temporarily. But dependency deepened, and resilience disappeared. Then came another critical shift: currency controls. Designed to protect national reserves, they instead created black markets, distorted prices, and encouraged corruption. Who benefited from cheap official dollars, and who was left paying the real price? As political tensions rose, economic decisions became tools of power rather than stability. Long-term planning gave way to short-term survival. The system still functioned, but only on the surface. So the question becomes unavoidable. Were these policies meant to protect the economy, or did they quietly dismantle it from within? By the time global oil prices fell, Venezuela was already standing on weak ground. The shock didn't create the crisis, it exposed it. Economic crises don't arrive overnight. They enter quietly, through supermarkets, paychecks, and daily routines. But when did ordinary Venezuelans first realize something was wrong? At first, it was small things. Certain products disappeared from shelves. Prices changed faster than wages. People began buying extra goods, not out of panic, but uncertainty. Could this really be temporary, as officials promised? Then inflation accelerated. How do families plan for the future when money loses value by the week? How do workers survive when salaries can no longer cover basic needs? Currency controls created two realities, an official economy and an underground one. Those with access to dollars survived. Those without watched their purchasing power vanish. Inequality widened, not because people stopped working, but because the system stopped working for them. Hospitals felt the strain. Businesses closed. Skilled workers left the country. Families were separated, not by choice, but by necessity. And still, the question lingered, how did a resource-rich nation reach this point? Was this the unavoidable result of falling oil prices? Or the delayed consequence of decisions made years earlier? For many Venezuelans, survival replaced opportunity. Barter returned. Informal markets expanded. Communities adapted, not because conditions improved, but because they had no alternative. And this leads to a deeper question. When an economy collapses, who pays the price first, the system, or the people living inside it? No economy exists in isolation. But how much of Venezuela's crisis was shaped from outside its borders? As political tensions grew, international pressure followed. Sanctions were introduced, restricting access to global financial markets, oil exports, and foreign investment. Supporters argued these measures were meant to force political change. Critics warned they would hit ordinary citizens hardest. So what actually happened? With fewer buyers and limited access to credit, government revenue shrank further. Oil production declined. Imports became harder to finance. The economy, already weakened from within, now faced external constraints that reduced its room to maneuver. But were sanctions the cause of the crisis, or a multiplier of existing problems? Did they create Venezuela's economic collapse, or simply accelerate a system already under strain? Global oil markets added another layer. Prices fell sharply, cutting the lifeline Venezuela depended on most. Other oil-producing countries adjusted. Venezuela couldn't. Years of underinvestment had left infrastructure fragile and production inefficient. Meanwhile, geopolitical rivalries reshaped alliances. Trade routes shifted. Financial access narrowed. And as global attention focused on politics, the economy continued to deteriorate quietly. This raises an uncomfortable question. When internal weakness meets external pressure, which one ultimately breaks the system? For Venezuelans, the distinction mattered little. The result was the same: scarcity, instability, and uncertainty about the future. When an economy stops growing, people adapt. But what happens when survival becomes the only goal? As inflation spiraled, salaries lost meaning. Money was spent the moment it was earned, sometimes within hours. Planning for the future became impossible. Saving disappeared. For millions, life turned into a daily calculation: food or transport, medicine or rent. So how did people cope? Informal economies expanded rapidly. Bartering returned. Goods were exchanged instead of money. Street markets filled the gaps left by failing supply chains. Communities relied on trust networks, family support, and shared resources, not because it was efficient, but because it was necessary. Migration reshaped society. Skilled workers, doctors, teachers, and engineers left in search of stability. Families were separated across borders. Entire neighborhoods changed as opportunity moved elsewhere. Was this an escape, or a silent signal that the system had failed its people? And yet, resilience persisted. Small businesses adapted. People improvised. New survival skills replaced long-term ambitions. Hope didn't disappear, but it narrowed. This raises a difficult question. When a society is forced to focus on survival, what happens to innovation, progress, and the next generation? An economy can recover. Infrastructure can be rebuilt. But rebuilding trust, between citizens and the system, is far harder. In the final part, we look ahead. Can Venezuela move from survival back to stability? And what lessons does this crisis offer to the rest of the world? Economic crises leave scars long after headlines fade. But is Venezuela's story already written, or can it still change? Recovery is not impossible. Other nations have rebuilt after deep economic collapse. But recovery demands difficult choices: restoring trust in institutions, stabilizing the currency, rebuilding production, and reducing dependence on a single resource. None of these happen overnight. So what stands in the way? Years of uncertainty have weakened confidence, both inside and outside the country. Investment avoids instability. Talent leaves when opportunity disappears. Reversing this requires more than oil. It requires governance, transparency, and policies that reward productivity instead of survival tactics. And yet, Venezuela still has advantages: vast natural resources, a young population, and a society that has proven remarkably adaptable under pressure. Resilience alone cannot rebuild an economy, but it can support reform when the conditions finally change. The deeper lesson goes beyond Venezuela. What happens when wealth is treated as endless? When short-term comfort replaces long-term planning? When systems ignore warning signs until collapse becomes unavoidable? Venezuela's crisis is not just a national tragedy. It is a global warning. Because the real question is not only what went wrong, but whether others are paying attention before facing the same choices.